We're running a bit late, so if you don't mind, we'll get started. I'm told we can go up to 13:11 in the local time. That would be 11 Zulu time for you logistics people. And because we're short of time, I'm not going to give a whole big introduction. Ursula Müller is the deputy head of OCHA and the most senior German citizen in the United Nations Secretariat, which of course she leaves her nationality at the door. But I thought it was worth mentioning. And she's going to talk for a while, and then I'll try and respond to her talk, and then we'll open up for questions. So, welcome.
Distinguished participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to participate in this year's Humanitarian Congress in Berlin. 10 years ago, I was here in my role as the humanitarian coordinator in the German government, and I'm really delighted to be here now, 10 years later, in my new role as the United Nations Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator and also Assistant Secretary General for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the UN. And we are all humanitarians, and we remain humanitarians, and we all advocate for the dignity of people in crisis. So I think it's a terrific topic for this that was chosen for this Congress. The themes that we will be discussing today reflect many of the major shifts that have been taking place across the system since the World Humanitarian Summit and across the humanitarian and development system. World Humanitarian Summit in May 2016 in Istanbul. Then we had the adoption of the Agenda 2030 on the Sustainable Development Goals, and the emphasis on prevention by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, which also focuses on reducing needs and vulnerabilities in fragile and risk settings. And I will explore these themes in a bit more depth, but let me just frame the context. As we are all aware, humanitarian organizations are operating in an era of exponentially growing humanitarian need. And this year, the United Nations coordinated global humanitarian appeal aims to mobilize $25.3 billion to meet the needs of 92 million people of the most vulnerable in the world. And this is almost 4 times as much as was required 10 years ago. The scale and extent of response requirements are a sign of the pressure and the expectations on the humanitarian sectors, as prolonged conflict and record-level displacement, rising hunger, and the devastating effects of climate change cause and continue to drive needs up. Last year marked the 3rd in a row where hunger levels rose, now with 821 million people facing chronic food deprivation. The average length of a humanitarian appeal has doubled from 4 years in 2005 to 8 years in 2018. Most humanitarian responses have been around for more than a decade, and some, including Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia and the Sudan, for more than 20 years. So this leaves millions of people trapped in vicious vulnerability cycles, dependent on short-term aid. But of course, that is not the fault of humanitarians. We aim to work towards, or we aim to work for people that are in need as long as they are in need. But it has become evident that a quick fix will not get these people's lives back on track. And it is in the interest of affected people and of humanitarian organizations to adopt a more sustainable approach. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has embarked on an ambitious reform agenda which builds on the complementarity and greater collaboration between humanitarian and development actors with a commitment towards prevention. These reforms recognize that much more can be done to stop crises to emerge in the first place, but also to prevent the relapse into conflict and crisis. Likewise, the Agenda 2030 for the Sustainable Development Goals recognized that we will only achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we find a way to include the millions of people who risk being left behind because of conflicts and chronic disasters. When it comes to humanitarian crisis, the former Secretary General of the United Nations Agenda for Humanity and the launch of the new way of working at the World Humanitarian Summit recognized that it is only by placing more collective emphasis on reducing need and vulnerability that we can release people from the vicious cycle of over-reliance on humanitarian assistance for years on end. This is not to say that humanitarian aid will step into the development sector's shoes. Rather, it calls for more shared analysis of the root causes of vulnerability so we can work to our comparative advantages to address them. So this approach will also commit us to strengthening our response capacity to react fast when sudden onset crises hit, like this week's earthquake in Indonesia. And it requires development actors to take greater risks, to act earlier. And also it requires donors to be more flexible with their funding. Over the past year, we have seen some encouraging efforts from the World Bank and other development actors to engage in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. The World Bank has stepped up its engagement in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. It has partnered with UNHCR and to address Syrian refugee needs and support displaced people in the Lake Chad Basin. And it has partnered with UNICEF in Yemen to support 1,800 health facilities. And in several fragile settings, including Central African Republic, Chad, and Yemen, humanitarians and development organizations and actors are undertaking more joined-up planning. The great fear is that these efforts will undermine the impartiality, independence, and neutrality of humanitarian assistance. And that through greater coherence with government agendas, there will be a greater risk of aid being instrumentalized. To give some clarity, in situations in hot conflict, where a state is party to the conflict, greater joined-up will not be sought. But we must recognize that humanitarians live and work in highly charged political contexts. And in many of these political environments, there are tensions between our obligations to save lives and the political impact of our actions. And we must continue to assess these on a case-by-case basis. The important thing in every context is, for humanitarians, that when we work with peace and development actors, we ensure aid is always delivered in an impartial way. Allow me to explore these dynamics in Yemen, the largest humanitarian crisis according to our office's assessment. In Yemen, the humanitarian response plan has received $930 million funding from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Today in Yemen, The humanitarian country team ensures that all aspects of the response are based solely on needs as identified and prioritized through rigorous needs assessment by the UN country team. And I can say that the response in Yemen, including advocacy for an end of this conflict and protection of civilians, remains highly principled. This has likewise been also our experience in other contexts where parties to the conflict have been major donors to humanitarian action, such as in Afghanistan and Iraq. In each context, we develop response plans based on thorough needs assessment that are coordinated across the United Nations and with the participants of many leading NGOs and civil society groups. The quality and rigor of needs assessments continues to be improved and needs to be improved, and efforts are underway to really enhance the quality of the needs assessment and also by developing joint assessments and analysis as part of the Grand Bargain Agreement. Cash transfers are also an increasingly useful tool in operations to reach across front lines of conflict and also to access populations that are otherwise difficult to reach. But cash is also a very effective modality. I just want to briefly share with you, when I was in Chad, I met with refugees that had to flee the violence from Boko Haram, from Nigeria, and I was under a tent, a large group of women sitting. And it was a program that was led by the World Food Program. One woman, I was sitting down with her, she proudly showed me her plastic card with her picture, with her name, a golden chip. And she went to the next tent, put her fingerprint on a little glass sheet, and was handed out cash. And I asked her, what do you prefer, being given in kind or getting the cash? And she said, I prefer the cash. I asked why. She said, this card gives me an identity. I have options. I can choose what I want to buy for my family. It gives me dignity. And I'd add, as an economist, it also develops local markets. In the future, we will increasingly also turn to data-driven predictive analytics to trigger financing for crisis prevention and early action. And it is our hope that adopting these trigger-driven systems, they will go some way to lessen the grip of politically driven decision-making in shaping humanitarian response in the years to come. For instance, at the General Assembly in New York last week, we saw the launch of the Famine Action Mechanism, a partnership with UN agencies, with the World Bank, with Google, with Microsoft and Amazon, which will use predictive analytics to trigger early financing to prevent severe food insecurity. And adopting an approach like this requires partnership, not only with development actors, but also with the private sector partners, who can not only lend their skills and technology, but also can help bring these approaches to scale and contribute to innovations in humanitarian assistance. The path to change will not always be smooth, and tensions will inevitably arise. But the best way to navigate that path is to foster dialogue and an exchange of views. And I'm looking forward now to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Ursula. You didn't avoid some of the subjects I thought you might avoid, so that's great. And look forward to a robust conversation. It strikes me that the UN reform and the ending needs is the area that some of the hardcore, let's say, purist, Junantist humanitarians have the biggest problem with? Is that it's not, they say the humanitarian's job is not to end need, it's somebody else's job, and you're mixing up too many things in one bucket. Do you feel there's any way you agree with that point, that humanitarian independence is threatened by these reform mechanisms? You can't speak truth to power if you're trying to do a negotiation with a host state, for example.
The reform of the development system of the United Nations is in the context of a wider reform by the Secretary General. There's the reform of the peace and security sector, the management reform, and the UN development sector reform. And the engine of this reform is the so-called resident coordinator on the ground, who is responsible to help the countries deliver on their commitments to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And looking at the various Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, take Sustainable Development Goal number 2, end poverty. I don't think we as humanitarians can say we don't want to contribute to ending poverty, because in the end it would reduce humanitarian appeals, and particularly the food delivery part, which is very expensive, if there is some livelihood and the ending poverty goal is reached. So I think we cannot say we don't care about SDGs, because overall it is our interest to end humanitarian needs.
But if you're a trauma surgeon, it's not your job necessarily to work on the arms trade. It's your job to fix the bullet wound.
Absolutely.
Shouldn't humanitarians, isn't there a danger to make it just too diffuse?
I strongly believe that humanitarian mission is to save lives, to take out that bullet, and advocate for the respect for international humanitarian law. I mean, a bullet, there's armed conflict. Humanitarians have to advocate for access, and that's something our colleagues of OCHA in the field are skilled to do. You need to get a convoy across lines. You need to advocate for respect for international humanitarian law, for impartiality, for all the humanitarian principles, and neutrality. So it's very important we as humanitarians keep this space. But we have all the interest that development actors come in earlier to take more risk and to really build resilient communities.
And is there any partnership that is sort of taboo? Silicon Valley and, I don't know, the pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of players that other groups might find unacceptable. How do you assess those sort of partnerships?
I think humanitarian challenges are huge. I was talking about innovations, and I used this example of the cash transfer. I would not have believed that to see this with my own eyes in the middle of the desert in Chad. And it is amazing what you can do with technology and innovation. 2 examples. First, I was trying to speak to people who are inventing things. I said, if someone could come up with a solution, how to make water out of air or sand at a larger scale, it would save us a lot of money, which we spend on trucking water across deserts for decades. Second example is the use of drones, for instance. There's an example in Rwanda, where the government of Rwanda agreed to having a corridor for drones to transport vaccines to areas that are very difficult to access. So I think we should crowd in and have partnerships with whoever can contribute to humanitarian solutions.
Thank you very much. I won't monopolize your time, so let's hear from the audience. I can look for a hand anywhere. You, I think, are the first I've spotted. A few more.
Thank you. My name is Corinna Kreidler. I'm an independent consultant. I would like to ask the question that is in the title, The Grand Bargain 2 years on. Where are we? Is it worth the effort, or is it a hype that will sort of slowly go away?
Thank you for the question. Actually, when I was walking around and looked at the various stands, I picked up or was given this card, which said, do not launch a new humanitarian reform. And I asked, why not? So we have the World Humanitarian Summit, we have the Grand Bargain, and we have to deliver on the grand bargain and implement the commitments that were already made. And there has been progress, albeit slow. There needs to be more progress. I mean, there was progress on the simplification of reporting, the multi-year funding. Donors have been forthcoming with multi-year funding, but there also is very slow progress, for instance, when it comes to unearmarked funding. I don't have any evidence, but my observation is that there is more earmarked funding by donors. And another commitment made by the 59 stakeholders of the Grand Bargain was accountability to the affected people. So I think we should keep going and remind all the stakeholders to deliver on their commitments.
Some more? Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So, Natalie, I'm a doctor with MSF. How do you feel the United Nations should balance the issue of innovation against conflict of interest with different partners?
I'm not sure whether I got the question, whether there's a conflict of interest between innovation and...
No, so obviously innovation is a priority, but conflict of interest is an important threat to impartiality, neutrality, and ultimately to the service that we want to deliver as humanitarians. How do you feel the United Nations should balance those competing priorities, avoiding conflict of interest and innovation?
As I mentioned, I think we need also transformation in how humanitarian assistance can be delivered. We need innovation, for instance, the data-driven innovation. I mean, refugees these days have all cell phones. They have apps. There's health information available on apps. I don't think there is a conflict of interest when we develop new partnerships and find solutions for the problems. It's pretty clear. The rules are the principles of humanitarian assistance and protection. I think the protection part is very important. And we spent about 80% of all the humanitarian funding in conflict-driven settings. And I don't see other actors, like the private sector, being engaged physically on the ground. But it's pretty clear that the United Nations is sort of the guardian also of the humanitarian principles. That does not preclude that we are searching for new solutions and innovations, how to really deliver humanitarian assistance, as I mentioned with the two examples by cash transfers and the drones.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice to have you back here. You just mentioned that you are, and that the UN, and you especially in your agency, you're responsible also for the respect for international humanitarian law. Now, we know that 4 at least members of the P5 are directly or indirectly involved in bombing hospitals. What do you think you can do about that, and how do you plan to go about that? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And there is an increasing disrespect for humanity on our globe. And the combatants have a disrespect for international humanitarian law. During the World Humanitarian Day, which is every year on the 18th of August, last year, OCHA launched a campaign. Actually, it was someone else's idea. Not a target. Hashtag not a target. So civilians are not a target. Humanitarian workers are not a target. Medical facilities are not a target. Schools are not a target. This went really viral. So we partnered with also media, social media and others, and also included celebrities because they have a huge followership, to really raise awareness that it is unacceptable behavior to target hospitals. I have the opportunity of briefing the Security Council of the United Nations, which is the body entrusted to take care and is responsible for peace and security. So every month they have a briefing on Syria, the humanitarian situation in Syria. So every time we mention how many hospitals have been again targeted, to really raise the awareness, and it's not acceptable. And these countries you mentioned are sitting on the Security Council. So if they have some influence on parties or parties on the ground, this is the way to raise it for us.
I've got one here, please.
My name is Rainer Lucht. I have to you, as you are a representative of the broader humanitarian UN system, a broader question: what do you think about the future of the UN humanitarian system facing a political UN which is more and more weaker, which is inactive or helpless in front of the bigger armed conflicts in the world? What you assess in this framework is the future of the UN, or the UN will be reduced to a humanitarian UN who only will provider of humanitarian aid and nothing more, and not resolving more or unable to resolve the political conflicts? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Actually, it was two questions in one. The first one was the wider humanitarian community, also outside the UN. I'm very proud to be part of this OCHA office, which is uniquely positioned to work with a wider humanitarian community through the Interagency Standing Committee, which I try also to have be more effective. But this is the platform for all the NGOs, civil society, to sort of really have a voice in the humanitarian system, also in the United Nations. Because without NGOs and local partners, humanitarian assistance could not be delivered. And this is another part of the grand bargain, the localization. It's not just the money, it's local partners are the ones who deliver assistance and protection to the people. So this is the wider system. Within the United Nations, you know, you have the UNHCR, World Food Programme, UNICEF, WHO. So we in our office, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, try to coordinate the UN system, prioritizing needs, fundraising. So this is the wider system. We all have to leverage on each other's comparative advantage. The second part of your question was, why do those big powers or the member states of the United Nations not solve the conflicts that cause so much human suffering? There seems to be a general rollback into nationalism. It was great to see last week in New York that 180 heads of states and governments met there. It's not only important that they give their speeches in front of this green marble wall, but that they have a lot of bilateral meetings. And I really expressed in various social media the hope that those leaders come together to find solutions for the conflicts that cause so much human suffering. So, you are absolutely right. The United Nations is relevant as never before, considering that there's so much inward looking of a lot of nations, to really have this multilateral forum to bring people together and talk and really find solutions.
Thank you so much. I think our time is up. It's been a long morning. I think we should. I've already failed, obviously, to meet the deadline, but within, not bad, you know. So, any final thoughts? Something more positive than the world falling apart and the UN being vaguely relevant?